The alarm was definitely not part of the simulation. Kieran Voss froze mid-sentence, stylus still hovering over his notepad as the classroom lights snapped to red. Across the room, Instructor Vellencleveran, moss-toned skin, stiffening, blinked up at the ceiling, confused, while cadets murmured in rising panic. The door locks hissed shut with a finality that made Kieran's stomach drop. A voice calm, mechanical, too calm, spoke over the intercom. Security breach. Lab Sector 3. Biocontainment failure. Shelter protocols engaged. Await further instruction. A moment of stunned silence passed. Then chaos. No one's responding on the comm. Are we locked in? Why are we locked in? Sector 3 is only 2 halls down. We're going to die, aren't we? Kieran stood slowly. His shoulder ached, not sharp pain, just the dull reminder of a close-quarters grappling drill gone wrong last week. The dislocation had been clean, but he'd needed 2 full days before he could lift his arm above his head again. Today had been the first time he hadn't taped it down. His eyes flicked to the emergency map panel glowing on the classroom wall. Sector 3. Xenobiocontainment and lab simulation. He remembered the schedule, no drills today. Then the display blinked. Once, then static. When the image returned, it wasn't simulations. It was carnage. Bodies, instructors, uniforms torn, limbs twisted in impossible directions. Blood, something wet dragging out of view, trailed by a heavy claw. Someone vomited behind him. Another cadet let out a short scream and stumbled over a desk. Panic ignited like flash paper. Instructor Veln tried to speak, but his translator collar glitched, only static hissed through. A moment later, a dark blur slammed against the hallway window outside the classroom. It was bipedal, huge. Covered in dark carapace and thick ridges like plated armor, Kieran caught the briefest flash of teeth. No eyes, just flaring heat-sensing pits and hooked digits too long for its arms. Zirek, a second year from the aquatic colony, Yizvan, shouted over the noise. That was a Sirvok apex beast. They were locked in Lab 3. What in Star's name is it doing in the halls? They're not supposed to be real, someone else shouted. They're for aggression, modulation studies, only partial brains. Then something went wrong. A cadet shrieked, clawing at the now sealed door console. We have to override. Get out. We have to go. They'll cut through the blast doors, said a tall, trembling Zixari noble cadet from the back. We're not soldiers. What are we supposed to do? Kieran's stylus still rested in his fingers. Stainless steel, weighted tip, meant for touch, interfaces, and handwriting. He glanced at it once, then at the screaming around him. The last thing he wanted to do was stand up again. But the shouting was growing louder, wild-eyed arguments erupting, cadets trying to force the door, others shouting over them, some frozen entirely. A cadet with glittering gray skin tried to issue orders, Luthari. Maybe, but no one listened. His voice broke halfway through a sentence, and he stammered something about protocol before collapsing into a chair. Then a voice high and strained broke through it all. What do you know about threats like that? You're just from some dirt world. Kieran turned. The cadet, he didn't know her name, yellow, scaled and shaking, was staring at him like she wanted to blame him for the monster outside. His answer was quiet, even. I'm from Earth. He picked up the stylus and tucked it behind his ear. I've lived with threats like this my whole life. Silence fell, then tension rippled through the group, like they couldn't tell if he was joking or confessing to a terrible curse. He didn't care. He walked to the back of the room, yanked a utility panel off the wall, and stared into the crawl space behind it. He'd seen the maintenance schematics for the building his first week. Not because he was planning for a breach, because that's just what you did when you grew up on a planet where things went wrong all the time. You learned the exits, the blind spots, the water pressure, the fuse layout, and where not to stand during a tremor or an ambush. The space was tight, barely enough room for him to crawl on elbows and knees. He pulled his injured arm in first carefully, watching how it moved. Still stiff, but working. He turned back once. No one else had moved. They're scanning for movement and body heat, he said. They'll go after noise and panic. If you stay quiet and low, the blast door should hold until help gets here. How do you know that? Asked someone in a whisper. Because I watched it avoid a corpse and charge the one that was crying. He slipped inside and pulled the panel back into place. The ventilation shafts connected to auxiliary labs. He moved slowly, controlled breaths, limbs tight to his body. After the first 20 meters, he stopped, braced himself, and taped his shoulder. The roll of binding tape from his uniform sleeve did the job in a pinch. Not perfect. Not enough to fight, but enough to climb. He emerged behind a stack of lockers in the auxiliary medical bay. No bodies. He worked quickly. Tubing from the IV kits. Adrenaline injectors, 3. Scalpel blades, he left the handles. Alcohol pads. 1 container of surgical glue. He pocketed a small thermal stim unit and a vial of oxidizer powder from the fire cabinet. Chair legs, 2 aluminum, 1 carbon steel composite, broken from the wreckage of a fallen medbot cart. But most importantly, the stylus. Heavy, solid, almost 7 inches, sharp enough if used right. He gripped it in his good hand and exhaled once. The first predator found him in the hall, outside Lab C-6. Kieran barely saw it before it charged. He threw himself aside, shoulder screaming, and drove the pen into its face as it passed. Not the face, the pit. The beast recoiled with a guttural sound that shook the lights. Then came the pain. A hook tore into his forearm as he fell. Not a clean slash, a punch wound. He landed hard on his left hip and rolled, smearing blood across the tile. He made it into the janitorial bay, slammed the door, and locked it manually. Breathing fast. Too fast. His forearm was bleeding badly. Muscle cut. Not deep enough to hit bone, but it had gone through his uniform, through skin, and out again. He pressed gauze to it, bit the inside of his cheek, and wiped it with alcohol before gluing the skin shut in strips. He wrapped it with sterile cloth, tied it tight with a belt, and sat back against the wall. His shoulder was throbbing again, overextended. No way he could use both arms now. Fine. One was enough. His eyes stayed on the hallway, through the vent grill. The beast stalked past after 3 minutes, silent as fog. Kieran didn't move. The next 2 hours were a slow war. He scavenged a discarded lens array from an optical lab and rigged it with thermal foil from the medical kits. When he left the dummy in an open stairwell and triggered a motion sensor, the next beast tore it to shreds. He used chemical heat packs to mimic body warmth and left them near cleaning drones. One predator attacked the whirring machine and tore itself open on an exposed conduit. Kieran didn't watch it die. He kept walking. His thigh screamed at him after the 4th sprint. He knew that pain. Pulled muscle. Left leg. Not torn but close. He limped to the maintenance level and found a heat pipe system. He rerouted one of the smaller lines into a sprinkler head and superheated the corridor, then lured the beast with an audio loop from a broken comm pad. The thing followed the call. It didn't survive the steam. Kieran crouched behind a coolant tank as it screamed. Later, he found a brief moment to sit, breathe. He ate 2 protein tabs and swallowed a pain suppressant with filtered water from the emergency wall station. Not much. Enough to dull the fire in his leg and ribs. His forearm bled again when he moved. The glue was breaking. The edges of the wound were puffy. He cleaned it again. Used more cloth. Used the last of the alcohol. He whispered to no one. Should have brought more. The stylus had blood on it. Some of it was his. He cleaned it on his uniform. Then stood. There was one left. And he knew where it had gone. The main lecture hall. The walls of the lecture hall were shaking. Kieran could hear it as he crept along the faculty wing's top crawlway, metal beams vibrating with each thud of weight below. Not erratic like before. This one moved slowly, purposefully, no more panic. It was stalking. Most predators lost interest after the first few minutes of a hunt. This one hadn't. Kieran's thigh was tight, the strained muscle locking more each time he crouched. His forearm throbbed under the fresh wrappings he'd re-glued the wound a few minutes ago with the last drop of polymer. It had gaped open slightly while climbing the inner ducting, and though the bleeding was slower now, it hadn't stopped. The fabric around the injury had stiffened and stuck. He blinked away sweat. The stim unit tucked under his jacket hummed faintly, pressed against his shoulder. He'd strapped it in place with half a power cable. The heat helped the shoulder stiffness. A little. He stopped when the ductwork turned over the auditorium space. Slits in the metal let him see below. Rows of overturned desks, broken seats, a toppled lectern, and a dozen cadets pinned behind a collapsed hollow display wall, whispering. One of them, he thought it was the Luthari who'd frozen earlier, was visibly shaking. And near the stage, the last predator. It stood still, breathing low. It sniffed the air, the slits along its snout pulsing, heat-sensing pits flared once. Then, it took another step toward the hiding cadets. Kieran pulled back. He couldn't fight like this, not head-on, not loud, no weapons, no gear, no drones, no automated systems. The override panels were all behind the predator. He exhaled, closed his eyes, thought. Back home, when he was 12, a cougar had wandered into the edge of his town. Not unusual, not deadly unless you did the wrong thing. He remembered the way the wildlife officer had stood at the edge of the ravine, unmoving, silent, waiting, not posturing, just ready. If the animal lunged, the officer would fall, no illusions about it. But that stillness had kept it from doing so. Predators didn't understand arrogance, but they respected stillness. Injury didn't mean weakness. It could mean bait. Kieran's hand drifted to the stylus tucked into the makeshift sheath he'd tied onto his boot. Then he looked up. The rigging, overhead. Steel girders, lighting mounts, a few hanging speaker units. If he could reach that, he could drop down behind the thing. If he could move fast enough. The pain in his ribs made itself known again. He jarred them on the fall. Earlier he hadn't wanted to admit it, but the bruising was deeper than he thought. Every breath pulled at something inside. He muttered, "Right. 5 hours in, and now the hard part starts." The access panel groaned when he opened it. He winced. The lecture hall echoed just slightly. Not enough for the predator to pinpoint him, but enough for it to pause. He climbed slowly onto the support beams. They creaked under his weight. The predator looked up, just once. Its heat pits tracked across the ceiling, but the overhead systems had been venting warmth all day. Nothing conclusive. It kept moving forward. The cadets whispered. One started to sob. Kieran saw the ripple of movement, and the predator turned. No time. He ran. He launched from the final beam as the thing reared up. Cadets screamed. He dropped. And landed wrong. His bad leg gave out. He crumpled to one knee, gasping as pain shot through his thigh. The predator spun, its front claws slashing through the air where he should have been. Kieran didn't fight the collapse. He let it bring him lower. And as the beast lunged again, he surged forward, twisting under its swipe, and drove the stylus into the base of its skull. Hard. The creature convulsed. A guttural, high-pitched shriek burst from its core as it flailed backward. Its legs buckled, and it slammed into the side wall, tearing through part of the stage. Kieran collapsed to the floor, pen still in his hand, his vision blurred. A few cadets shouted. One ran toward him. Another stayed back, pulling a classmate close. He blinked once. The lights overhead shimmered, red, then white. His hand trembled. The pen was still in it. Bent, blood-streaked. He tried to push himself up and nearly passed out. His leg failed again. His forearm screamed. His ribs felt like they'd been wrapped in knives. Breathing became harder. So he just sat. Back against the wall, pen resting in his lap. One of the cadets, young, purple-eyed, from a low-gravity world, whispered, "What? How did you even survive out there?" Kieran didn't answer. He just breathed. And let the darkness come. The rescue team arrived 5 hours and 17 minutes after the breach alarm. By then, the halls were quiet. Security units swept through Sector 3 and found 6 Sirvok-class hunter beasts, 4 dead, 1 trapped between 2 sealed doors, 1 unconscious in the lecture hall. It took them almost 20 minutes to pry the stylus from its skull, and another 10 to find Kieran. He was still seated by the lecture hall wall, semi-conscious, his lips cracked and blood dried into his uniform. They lifted him gently onto a stretcher. When the medtech tried to remove the makeshift sling, he groaned in pain and his right arm spasmed. One of the instructors retrieved hours earlier and revived with stim therapy recognized him. "Is that the Earth cadet?" The medic checked his vitals, adjusting the IV feed. "He's in shock. Forearm puncture, likely infection starting. Torn left thigh muscle, multiple abrasions, probable rib fractures. blood pressure's bottoming. Stabilize him. We're already losing fluids. They got him to the medical bay with minutes to spare. Kieran didn't wake during the emergency surgery. They cleaned and debrided the arm wound, then stitched the muscle layers carefully, watching for internal clotting. His thigh required a stabilizing brace and 6 weeks minimum before full movement would return. His ribs, 2 cracked, 1 nearly fractured, were wrapped. He'd be in respiratory therapy for at least 10 days. When he finally opened his eyes, the first thing he saw was the ceiling. White. Still. The second thing was his stylus. Sitting on the medbay table next to his bed. Bent. Polished. Clean. He didn't reach for it. Just stared. Then slept again. Word spread. Within 12 hours of his surgery, the surviving cadets had begun whispering in the halls. Not loud, not boastful, just careful. Even the ones who hadn't seen him fight understood one thing now. You didn't ask a Deathworlder what they knew about danger. You didn't talk over them. You didn't call them paranoid. You listened. The Luthari cadet who had panicked during the lockdown visited the medbay once, brought him a handwritten note, and left it by the side of the bed. Kieran never mentioned what it said. Instructors reviewed all internal footage and found the trail of traps, the bodies, the improvised systems in the heat piping and chemical labs, the thermal bait, the reflection loop, the repurposed drone engine. He'd mapped the entire predator behavior within the first hour and used nothing but tools available to first years. Except the pen. The stylus wasn't standard issue. It was heavier, older, a gift. From his sister. She'd left Earth 2 years ago, posted to an outer rim station on Europa's moons. The pen had come with a note. Sometimes, writing is the sharpest weapon. Just hope you never need it to be literal. He remembered the note now. It made him laugh quietly, and then not at all. His ribs still hurt when he breathed too deep. The Zirvok issued a formal apology 3 days after the incident. They insisted the beasts had been prototypes. Neural inhibitors failed. Aggression centers regrew tissue spontaneously. It had been an accident. Kalaran Academy quietly ended all Zirvok biomech testing. The cadet curriculum was updated a week later. A new module added to the Ethics and Tactics course. Tactical Improvisation under Predatory Stress, Earth Case Study. Kieran's name wasn't printed in the description, but the module included excerpts of recovered footage, photos of traps, and a scanned copy of the bent stylus. His stylus. The one sitting on the medbay table. He didn't ask for it back. He had a new one now. Lighter. Less personal. But it wrote just fine. Day 4 of recovery. And Kieran Voss lost his first argument with the medbed. Sit back or you'll tear the sutures, chirped the soft-voiced nurse AI for the 3rd time. I'm trying to sit back. I just need to reach. Can you not lock the incline mid-move? The bed beeped disapprovingly and froze in place with a hydraulic hiss. His upper back hung at an awkward 45 degrees. Kieran hissed and laid back again, closing his eyes. His ribs flared, the stitches in his arm pulled like angry thread. His thigh itched beneath the immobilizer sleeve, and his shoulder had started its morning protest early, stiff from being restrained overnight. He'd barely slept. 4 days into medbay confinement, and every hour had been a battle against boredom, pain, or a well-meaning alien nurse with no idea how human joints worked. Still, he wasn't dead. That counted for something. The door slid open with a soft pneumatic hiss. Kieran didn't look up at first. Most of the visitors didn't knock. Cadet Voss. He turned his head. Instructor Marlex. Coalition observer. Tall, 4-armed, and shaped like a furless, rigid-limbed heron with ceremonial armor plating too shiny for a battlefield. I heard you regained full consciousness this morning. Kieran nodded. If by full you mean dizzy and mad at a chair, yeah, fully conscious. The instructor stepped closer, slow and deliberate. The Academy Council has completed their review of the incident. You were the only mobile cadet for 5 hours and 11 minutes. All other contact was severed. No one else engaged directly. Kieran said nothing. There wasn't really a question in there. Marlex continued. The report is difficult to reconcile. No known survival training matches the improvisation we witnessed. There was no formal tactic applied to your choices, No procedural logic. No, Kieran said simply. There wasn't time for formal. You used fire suppression to blind the thermal sensing predators and audio interference to break up hunting packs. That level of adaptive engagement? I didn't engage, Kieran interrupted, a little sharper than he meant. I avoided. When I couldn't avoid, I distracted. When I couldn't distract, I attacked. A pause. And you fought them with a pen. Kieran tilted his head toward the table by the bed. The new stylus was there. Sleek, lightweight, shiny. Not bent, not covered in blood. Different pen, he muttered. Physical therapy started on day 7. The pain was immediate, not sharp, just constant. Ribs were wrapped in a rigid binder, restricting his breathing enough that he had to pause between stretches. The thigh brace stayed on, limiting movement, but they removed it for hydrotherapy to prevent stiffness. His shoulder wasn't allowed any direct weight yet. He practiced fine motion, first squeezing a soft gel ball, slow wrist rotations, shoulder rolls. The forearm wound was healing well, but the nerves around the injury were still raw. The skin was tight, and every flex stung like fire. He said very little. The therapists, 3 in rotation, all coalition learned quickly not to push conversation unless they wanted short, factual answers. He followed the schedule, he followed the reps, he didn't complain. He gritted his teeth sometimes, bit his tongue once, but he didn't fall behind. Each night, he sat up in bed for as long as the medbed allowed and wrote in a plain, thin notebook the medical staff hadn't noticed. The stylus scratched softly across the page. He didn't write stories or reflections. He wrote maps, notes, layouts of the academy, weak spots in wall reinforcement, crawl spaces, access panels. Emergency planning, if anyone asked. But no one did. On day 11, one of the cadets visited. It was Zirek, the aquatic one, pale blue skin that shimmered slightly in the light. He'd been the first to recognize the predator outside the classroom, Kieran remembered, the one who'd shouted in panic. He looked better now, paler than usual, but alert. I'm not sure if I'm allowed in here, Zirek said quietly, clutching a small metal container. They said 5 minutes max. Kieran nodded once and motioned to the chair beside the bed. The cadet sat awkwardly, eyes flicking around the medbay room. They're still talking about what you did. The council, the instructors, everyone. He shifted the container in his lap. I wanted to say something before the story gets too far from what actually happened. Kieran waited. Zarek leaned forward. You didn't just fight those things. You held it together when no one else could. And that mattered more than the pen, or the traps, or whatever. You didn't panic. Everyone else did. I did. He placed the container on the table. It's not much, just tea. Synth steeped on my homeworld. Calms the nerves. Helps with recovery, too. Kieran glanced at it. Then at Zirek. I'm glad you made it, he said, voice quiet. Zirek smiled a little, then stood. The rest of the class, most of them, they're different now. Toward you, toward each other, too. I don't need them to treat me different, Kieran said. Yeah, Zirek replied. But maybe we need to treat you different. He left after that. Kieran didn't touch the tea until later. When he did, it was strong, bitter, but it helped. He slept without pain meds for the first time that night. By day 15, he was walking under supervision, slowly, stiffly. The ribs protested, but the brace helped. The thigh burned if he tried to lift it too high, but the swelling had gone down. His shoulder was still weak. That would take longer, possibly another month before he could resume full movement drills. His arm was healing faster than expected, but the scar would be permanent. A half circle above the wrist, deep enough that the muscle hadn't closed clean. He stretched it every morning now. Carefully. The instructors had stopped asking questions. The files were closed. But not everyone had let it go. Cadets started drifting through the medbay in the days that followed, never in groups, always alone. Some asked what happened. Some just sat in the chair and said nothing at all. One left a piece of paper that read, "You didn't have to, but you did." He didn't recognize the handwriting. He kept the note. On the last morning of his second recovery week, Kieran was cleared to leave medbay housing for limited hours. The first place he went wasn't the cafeteria or the dorms. He went to the lecture hall. The repairs had already begun, scaffolding lined one wall, and the scent of solder and cleaning agent lingered. The blast marks had been scrubbed out. The damage to the desks still showed in warped metal and scorched synthetic wood. He walked slowly down the center aisle and stopped at the base of the stage. There, marked by a faint discoloration in the floor, was the spot where the last predator had fallen. He stood in silence for a moment. No grandeur, no ceremony. He reached into his coat pocket and took out the old stylus, the bent one. He'd asked for it back 3 days ago. The technician had handed it over reluctantly, polished and sealed in a clear preservation case. Kieran had pried it open that same night. Now, he walked to the edge of the stage, knelt slowly, and placed the stylus on the floor. Not as a memorial, just a marker. Then he stood, turned, and walked back out. It had been 39 days since the breach. The early winter rains outside the Kalaran Intergalactic Academy shimmered against the hex-glass domes. Rain didn't happen naturally on Relian 6. It was synthesized, scheduled, managed, filtered, before it ever touched the air. Still, it made the Academy look eerily Earth-like that morning. Damp walkways. Steam rising in soft curls from the plaza tiles. The sort of gray stillness Kieran Voss hadn't missed, but felt strangely grounded by. He leaned on his crutch as he stepped out of the rehabilitation wing, shoulder sling finally off, left thigh still braced under his uniform pants. Walking was slow, but steady. "Cadet Voss," said a voice to his left. Instructor Tazrin stood near the atrium entrance, arms folded across his slender torso, expression unreadable behind the glimmer of his refractive facial markings. Tazrin was savant, strict, precise, and notorious among cadets for his memory. "We'll need you in observation room 4 in 20 minutes, he said. Kieran gave a slow nod. "Is this about the lecture?" Tazrin gestured toward the hallway. "It's about setting the record straight." Observation room 4 wasn't used often. It was meant for diplomatic simulations, treaty arbitration, psychological profiling. Half the room was one-way glass, the other half, seating. When Kieran stepped in, 12 cadets were already seated. A few he recognized Xeric among them, perched quietly in the back. A few looked like newer arrivals. First years, probably. All eyes turned to him. He hated that part. A long desk had been placed at the front. One chair. A single object waited there, the stylus. Not the new one. The bent one. He sat. Behind the glass, silhouettes moved observers, instructors, and 2 coalition evaluators from the investigation board. They said nothing. Instructor Tazrin cleared his throat and faced the room. "You've all studied the breakdown of the Sector 3 incident. You've read the formal report, but you haven't heard from the one who survived it." He turned to Kieran. "Cadet Voss, speak as you choose." Kieran stared at the stylus for a moment before speaking. "I'm not here to inspire anyone," he said. Murmurs in the room stilled. Someone shifted uncomfortably in the back row. "I'm not a hero. I'm not a tactician. I didn't have a plan." He looked up, meeting eyes. "When the breach happened, I reacted the way I was raised to. Earth isn't a place where things wait for you to figure them out. Earth throws things at you, and you either improvise or you don't make it to the next decision." The silence in the room changed. He wasn't sure how, just heavier now. "The pen wasn't a symbol. It was the only thing I had that could go through chitin." A soft chuckle broke from one cadet before being quickly muffled. Kieran didn't smile. "I didn't expect to live. Every time I stopped, every time I set a trap or turned a corner, I knew it could be the last time. I didn't make choices because I knew they would work. I made them because there was nothing else left to try." He placed the stylus back on the desk and sat back, his ribs tightening slightly with the motion. "I did what I did because no one else could move. And if I hadn't moved, a lot more of us would be dead." Instructor Tazrin turned to the room. "Questions." A hand rose, a cadet with mirrored skin and pupil-less eyes. "How did you know what would work?" "I didn't." Another hand. "Would you do it again?" Kieran looked at them for a long moment, then said, "Not if I had the choice." They didn't make him stay long after that. The questions dwindled. The instructors ended the session without ceremony. A few cadets approached him in the corridor afterward. Most just nodded. A few shook his hand. One of the newer first years stopped him outside and asked softly, "Is it true you built one of the traps using lab-grade epoxy and thermogel tubing?" Kieran blinked. "That trap killed it by accident. I just needed it to slow down." The cadet looked stunned. Kieran kept walking. The academy's spring semester began 2 weeks later. He returned to normal classes, though normal felt different now. There were nods in the halls, conversations that paused slightly when he entered. Not in fear, not even in admiration, just awareness. That was fine. He didn't want awe, he wanted quiet. His instructors, however, had stopped treating him like a curiosity. Before the breach, he'd been the obligatory Deathworlder, in every class, half joked about, half studied, frequently dismissed. Now, they listened when he spoke, not because of the pen, but because of how he'd survived long enough to use it. On the 4th day of lectures, the newest tactical course began with a new rule on the digital syllabus. Rule Hashon: never assume your opponent thinks like you do, especially if they're from Earth. Kieran blinked at the line. He looked across the classroom. No one laughed. The instructor walked in, one of the newer staff, a rugged Carthy male who hadn't been present during the breach. "Right," he began. "Today we're reviewing improvisation under hostile pressure." He tapped the display wall. It flickered, and up came a familiar freeze frame. Kieran, crouched behind a coolant tank, stylus gripped tight, watching a predator pass by. "This," the instructor said, "is what happens when a cadet uses nothing but medical tubing, heat packs, and a writing instrument to outmaneuver apex killers. If you think it's about strength, you've already failed the lesson." He tapped again. The image zoomed in. "This isn't a glorification of recklessness. This is an example of pattern exploitation, environmental analysis, and pain tolerance under extreme conditions. No firepower, no support, no backup." The instructor's eyes swept the room. "We don't expect you to do what he did. We do expect you to learn why he did it." Kieran didn't say a word the whole lesson. At the end of class, the instructor lingered as cadets filed out. He approached Kieran. "Didn't want to use your name during lecture," he said quietly, "but I hope you're all right with me using your example." Kieran shrugged with his good shoulder. "It's not about me." The instructor gave a slow nod. "You know, the Zirvok were watching the footage too," he added. Kieran raised an eyebrow. "They issued a species-wide recall of their biomech program, claimed the prototypes were unrepresentative of their intent. But, between you and me, they're scared." Kieran paused. "Of a cadet with a pen?" "No," the instructor said. "Of someone who didn't stop moving. That terrifies predators more than anything." The stylus sat in a sealed case now. Not in a trophy display, not mounted on a wall. Just inside Kieran's drawer, under his bed, wrapped in the same cloth used on his forearm that night. He didn't show it off. He didn't talk about it. But every few weeks, when he was alone and his shoulder still ached a little too much from drills, he took it out, held it for a moment, and then put it back. Not as a reminder of what he'd done, but of what it had cost him to do it. On a rain-damp afternoon during finals prep, he sat outside the student atrium, legs stretched stiffly in front of him, watching a trio of first years practice heat-mapping drills in the grass. One of them noticed him, walked over nervously. "Sir," she said, though he was barely a year older than her, "can I ask something?" Kieran didn't stop watching the drill. "You can ask." "Would you really do it again? Go out there, face all that, just for the rest of the class?" He didn't answer immediately. After a while, he pulled his new stylus from his jacket and began spinning it between his fingers. Calm. Controlled. Then he looked at her. "I didn't do it for the class," he said. "I did it because there wasn't anyone else who could move." The cadet nodded. It took her a moment to walk away. Kieran turned his eyes back to the field and just watched.